right, so we are going to go over these notes here. They're the corresponding parts notes, and it's really an introduction to congruent triangles. And so that's the first main idea that we have is congruent triangles and what they are. So two triangles are congruent, which we have been learning how congruent means they are the same. They are equal, same size, equal values. And so these two triangles would be considered congruent if they had the same side lengths and the same angles. So triangles with the same sides and angles are congruent triangles, right? It just means that all their parts need to be congruent. And this means all corresponding parts, sides, and angles are congruent. And so here's an important idea. When you have two triangles that are congruent, you match up their congruent parts, and those are corresponding. And it's very similar to how when we did transformations, there were the corresponding parts in the pre-image and image, and remember they were rigid, so the size stayed the same. So it's a very similar idea here. But in order to show these corresponding parts and really describe which parts are corresponding, now we're going to write congruency statements. And this is why it's so important that you are very careful when you label triangles. So a congruency statement is something like this right here. And I'll read it to you. What this says is that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. And now what this congruency statement does is it lists the corresponding points in order, so we know which pieces in each triangle are corresponding. For example, triangle ABC, the first letter is A. In triangle DEF, the first letter is D. What that tells us is that A and D are corresponding. So A corresponds with D, and that means that any angles or lines that meet at these points are going to be corresponding pieces. So like we have an angle at that point, angle A, and we have the angle at D, those are corresponding, which means that they are congruent. The second letter in each, I've got B and then E. So that means point B and point E are corresponding. So their angles are congruent. But it also shows us a side that's congruent. So between A and B, notice A is congruent to D, B is congruent to E. So that means the line between A and B should be corresponding with the line between D and E. Another way to see that is by the first two letters together, right? A, B, D, E. And then the last letter we have here is C and F. So again, C and F are corresponding, so their angles are congruent, but also they create corresponding sides as well. Like we said, the sides and the angles are all corresponding and congruent. Now, once we know that two triangles are congruent, we also know CPCTC. What does that mean? Well, CPCTC stands for congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So every letter C is the word congruent, but it just says that congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And so when we get into these congruent triangles, we can actually say that two triangles are congruent without knowing that all their pieces are congruent. But once we know that the two are congruent, we can say that, well, then all the pieces must be congruent. And so that's kind of what CPCTC is. It's hard to fully understand without seeing an example. So if you're still a little bit confused, we'll definitely get to that later. All right, so we're going to practice writing some congruency statements here. So looking at number 1, I have the initial congruency statement, which is that the triangle JKL is congruent to triangle PQR. And so what I need to do is first start writing some angle congruency statements. I'm going to look at the first letter in the first triangle and the second letter in the first letter in the second triangle. So we've got J and P. That means that those are corresponding parts, so their angles are congruent. So we can write an angle congruency statement. Now, what does that look like? We said angle J is congruent to angle P. And I can do that for all of them. So the second letter is K, and then the other second letter is Q. So I know that angle K is congruent to angle Q. And then the last letter is L. The last letter here is R. So angle L is congruent to angle R. Now, just like the angles, we can do the same for the sides. But remember, to list a line segment, you have to use the beginning and ending points on that segment, right? So it should be 2 letters. So we're going to go through and we're going to look for the first 2 letters in each triangle. So here we've got JK and then PQ. So that means side JK, and we do the bar for line segment if you remember, is congruent to the side line segment PQ. Now I can do the same thing with the second letters, right? Then we go on from K to L and then Q to R. So I can say KL line segment is congruent to QR line segment. And then the very last one here, we stopped at L, right? KL. We stopped at the last letter. We're going to go back to the first one. L to J, R to P. And now if you notice, these points should match up with their corresponding points always. Like for example, anywhere there's a J in the congruency statement, there should be a P. So like notice here, J comes first, so P comes first. Whereas in the last statement, J comes last, so P comes last. So notice they're always going to be buddied up once you read that first congruency statement. Now we're going to write a second congruency statement, writing a congruency statement of the actual triangles themselves. Okay, so when we write a triangle congruency statement, like what we have up here, we list the points for the first triangle in any order we want. So I'm going to scramble up JKL, and let's say I go LKJ. I just scrambled them up and went into a different order. And that's totally fine. But what's really important is the way that we name the second triangle then. We need to name it so that the corresponding points are in the same location. So which point was corresponding to L? That would have been point R, because those are the last points. So that means because the first triangle starts with L, the second one has to start with R. Okay, what was corresponding with the letter K? Well, K is the middle letter in the first triangle, and Q is the middle letter in the second triangle. So it must be that K and Q go together. And the last one, J. Well, J was the first letter, and so was P. And also here, if you look at our angles congruency statements we wrote, we had already said that J and P were corresponding. So we can see how the last letter here, oh, I went to write J, should be P. So when you write your own congruency statements for triangles, it doesn't matter the order of the first one, but what does matter is that the order of the second triangle matches. All right, this next question and the one after that in your notes are going to be you try problems on the Desmos. So continue on to the next 2 slides, fill in what you can, and then you'll continue back with some more videos.